Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History for Deep Rest. Tonight you are standing at the edge of a frozen landscape where the cold feels personal, the kind that sneaks under your clothes and settles into your bones. The air is so sharp it almost rings when you breathe in, and every sound carries farther than it should. You're about to learn how entire Native American communities lived through winters like this without fire to gather around and without metal to trap heat. And yes, you probably won't survive this if you try it unprepared with a hoodie and good intentions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, and instead of pulling back from the cold, you step into it. You quickly realize that warmth here is not something you create, it is something you notice. The first mainstream historical fact you brush up against is surprisingly simple. Many indigenous communities across North America developed cold survival systems long before widespread fire use in winter shelters, relying instead on environmental insulation, body heat, and behavioral rhythm. This wasn't a fallback plan, it was intentional. Fire could attract enemies, consume precious fuel, or fill enclosed spaces with suffocating smoke. So, warmth had to come from quieter sources. You feel the ground under your feet and sense how it holds a different temperature than the air. Even in winter, the earth changes temperature, slowly releasing stored warmth upward. This is why so many winter shelters were partially sunken, dug into soil, or banked with earth. You kneel, touch the ground, and notice it does not bite like the wind does. It almost feels patient. There is a quirky little detail you might not expect. In some regions, people intentionally slept with their heads lower than their feet, believing colder air pulled near the ground, while warmer air rose just enough to matter. Whether or not it made a measurable difference, the practice stuck for generations. Historians still argue whether this was a true thermal strategy or a ritualized habit that simply encouraged consistent sleeping posture. Either way, people slept and survived. You move closer to a shelter, low and rounded, shaped like it belongs to the land, rather than sitting on top of it. There are no sharp corners, no high ceilings. Everything is close, intimate. Warmth does not like open space. It escapes. So these structures shrink the air itself, forcing body heat to linger. You step inside and immediately notice the quiet. Wind is the real enemy, not cold. Once the air stops moving, your body gets a chance to catch up. You are not alone in here. That matters more than anything else. Body heat is cumulative. One person is vulnerable, two are warmer. A group becomes its own heat source. You sit shoulder to shoulder, knees pulled in, sharing warmth without comment. This was not considered uncomfortable. It was considered normal. Privacy was a luxury for warmer seasons. You hear breathing around you. Slow, measured. Each breath releases moisture and warmth into the enclosed space. Over time, the air changes. It becomes softer, less hostile. A fringe observation from early European visitors noted that these spaces sometimes felt warmer than their own fire-heated tents. They didn't understand how, and often dismissed it as exaggeration. Modern researchers still debate how much of this warmth came from insulation versus sheer human density. Your clothing helps, but not in the way modern jackets do. There is no metal, no buttons, no zippers. Instead, layers overlap. Fur faces inward, hide outward. The goal is not to seal heat perfectly, but to manage moisture. Sweat is dangerous. Wet fabric pulls heat away faster than cold air ever could. So clothing breathes. It adjusts as you move. You loosen it when walking, tighten it when still. This constant adjustment becomes second nature. You notice something else. People do not rush. Sudden movement creates sweat. Sweat creates danger. Everything is deliberate. When you step outside, you do so with intention. When you return, you pause, brush snow away, let cold air slip off before entering. These small habits stack up minute by minute, hour by hour, keeping you alive. A widely accepted historical understanding tells us that many Native American winter strategies prioritized energy conservation over heat production. Calories were precious, exhaustion was deadly, so warmth came from stillness as much as action. This runs completely against modern instincts, which tell you to move to stomp, to shake off cold. Here you learn to be calm. There is also belief woven into this. Cold is not an enemy to be conquered, it is a condition to be respected. Elders taught children not to curse the cold, not to challenge it. Instead, you acknowledge it, adapt to it, and move with it. Some anthropologists suggest this mindset reduced panic and improved survival odds. Others argue it simply reflected a worldview shaped by long exposure. The debate stays open, but the results speak quietly for themselves. As night settles in, you feel the temperature drop further. But inside the shelter wrapped in earth, for shared breath and practiced calm, the cold loses its sharpness. It becomes background noise. You listen to it instead of fighting it. The wind passes overhead. Snow piles up, adding another layer of insulation. Yes, snow helps. That still surprises people today. You adjust your position slightly, tucking hands closer to your core. Someone shifts beside you. No one speaks. There is no need. Warmth here is not dramatic. It does not roar or flicker. It hums. And as your breathing slows to match the rhythm of the group, you begin to understand something fundamental. Surviving cold without fire or metal was never about toughness. It was about attention, about knowing when to move, when to stop, when to press close, and when to let the land do some of the work for you. The night stretches on steady and quiet, and you remain warm enough. You wake without fully waking the way people do, when the cold shifts slightly, but does not threaten. Your eyes stay closed, your body knows where it is. The shelter holds its shape around you, and the land outside continues doing what it has always done. Freeze, thaw, breathe. You stay still for a moment because stillness is warmth. Movement comes later. As you ease into awareness, you begin to notice how carefully this place was chosen. This is one of those mainstream historical realities that often gets overlooked. Native American winter camps were rarely random. They were positioned with an intimate understanding of terrain wind patterns and seasonal sun angles. You are not on a ridge where wind scours heat away. You are not in a low basin where cold air pools endlessly. You are tucked just enough into the land to borrow its protection. You imagine stepping outside and tracing the contours with your eyes. A slope behind the shelter breaks the wind. A stand of trees nearby slows air without casting heavy shade. Even bare branches matter. They interrupt airflow just enough to reduce heat loss. You may not feel it immediately, but over hours and days, this placement keeps bodies alive. There is a strange comfort in realizing that the land itself is participating in your survival. You are not fighting nature. You are using its quieter features. Rocks absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. Soil acts as insulation. Snow fills gaps and seals cracks. This is not accidental. Generations learned these lessons through careful observation, not theory. Here is a quirky detail that tends to surprise modern listeners. In some regions, people intentionally avoided clearing snow too aggressively around shelters. Instead of viewing snow as an obstacle, they treated it as a resource. Packed snow along walls reduced drafts and stabilized interior temperatures. Early European accounts describe indigenous shelters, half-buried and mistakenly assumed abandonment. In reality, these were some of the warmest dwellings available. You shift slightly and feel how the ground beneath you is prepared. There is no bare earth touching skin. Layers matter. Dried grasses, reeds, bark, sometimes fur. Each layer traps air. Air is what holds warmth, not the material itself. This principle remains true today, even inside your modern mattress. The difference is that here every layer was gathered by hand, tested by winter, and adjusted year after year. Historians still argue whether certain shelter placements were primarily practical or spiritually guided. Some oral traditions describe ancestors being taught where to settle by animals or dreams. Archaeological evidence confirms consistent use of specific locations across centuries. Whether guided by belief observation, or both, the outcome was reliable warmth. You listen to the sounds around you. Outside, snow shifts. Somewhere farther off, wind moves through branches with a hollow sound. Inside, there is very little noise. That silence is intentional too. Loud shelters require openings. Openings leak heat. Everything here favors containment. Heat is treated like water. You do not spill it unless you must. You begin to understand that warmth is not a single solution, but a system. Location supports shelter. Shelter supports bodies. Bodies support one another. Clothing supports skin. Behavior supports everything. If one part fails, the others compensate. This redundancy is what kept people alive through winters that would crush isolated individuals. There is also timing involved. You do not rise early just because the sun appears. Mornings are coldest. Activity waits until light has done some work. Tasks are grouped to minimize exposure. You step outside only when there is purpose. Wandering is a luxury reserved for warmer months. A lesser-known observation from early traders notes that indigenous winter camps often smelled faintly sweet and earthy rather than smoky. Without constant fire, air stayed breathable. This reduced respiratory illness, which could be deadly in cold months. Some modern researchers suggest this contributed to overall winter survival rates, though others caution against drawing firm conclusions from limited records. The debate lingers quietly. As you sit up now, pulling your coverings closer, you realize how different this feels from modern cold exposure. There is no frantic effort to heat space instantly, no blast of artificial warmth. Instead, heat accumulates slowly, it settles, it stays. You step outside, briefly feeling the cold press in sharp and alert, but it does not frighten you. You know where warmth waits. You know how to return without losing too much of yourself to the air. Your body moves efficiently, minimizing exposure. When you re-enter the shelter, receives you back, sealing around you like a held breath. You sit again among others. No one comments on the cold. It is not a topic of conversation. It is a condition of life. Stories will come later when energy allows. For now, warmth is maintained through shared stillness. And as the day begins its slow pale rise over the land, you feel a quiet confidence settle in. Not bravado, not defiance, just the steady knowledge that this place chosen with care will hold you through another cold stretch. You lower yourself closer to the ground, now not out of exhaustion, but because you are beginning to understand something subtle. The earth is not just beneath you, it is working with you. When you press a palm down, you can feel that it is not as cruelly cold as the air. The soil holds memory, heat from days ago, from bodies before yours, from the slow pulse of the planet itself. This is one of those widely accepted historical realities that sounds almost poetic but proves stubbornly practical. Many Native American winter shelters were partially subterranean because earth is one of the most effective natural insulators available. Temperature changes move slowly through soil. While the air above can plunge suddenly, the ground resists extremes. By sinking living space downward, people stepped out of the most violent temperature swings. You imagine the work that went into this. Digging with wood-bone antler. No metal blades, no iron edges, just patience and repetition. The result was not a hole, but a thermal pocket. Walls thick with packed earth. Roofs layered with brush bark, hide and sod. From the outside, these shelters blended into the land so well that early outsiders often failed to notice them at all. There is a quirky detail that still fascinates researchers. In some regions, entrances were deliberately made low and narrow, forcing anyone entering to crawl. This was not about humility or symbolism, though later stories sometimes framed it that way. It was about heat. Warm air rises. By keeping the opening low, warmth stayed inside. Cold air fell and pooled near the entrance instead of sweeping through the living space. You feel this immediately when you duck inside the cold, clinging to your legs while your upper body remains protected. Historians still argue whether the exact depth of these shelters was standardized or adapted family by family. Some archaeological sites show remarkable consistency, others vary widely. This suggests a flexible knowledge system, one that responded to local soil water levels and winter severity rather than rigid rules. The idea of a single design misses the point. Adaptation was the design. You settle inside again, noticing how the walls feel close but not oppressive. Everything is within reach: tools, bedding, food stores. There is no wasted movement. The ceiling slopes gently, encouraging warm air to circulate back down instead of escaping upward. You breathe in and feel the air change with each breath. Slightly warmer, slightly more humid, easier. Snow plays a role here too. As it accumulates on the roof, it adds insulation. Snow traps air, lots of it. This is a mainstream physical fact that surprises people who associate snow only with danger. Inside a snowbank, temperatures stabilize. This same principle is why snow shelters work even in extreme cold. You listen as snow settles overhead, sealing tiny gaps and making the shelter quieter, safer. There is an old fringe observation recorded by a French trapper who described these earth-covered shelters as feeling like the inside of an animal burrow. He meant it dismissively, but the comparison is accurate. Burrowing animals survive winter by stepping into the Earth's thermal buffer. Humans here did the same consciously or not. Some anthropologists argue this represents convergent survival behavior rather than cultural borrowing. Others suggest long observation of animals directly informed human design. The discussion remains open. You adjust your bedding again. Dried plant matter beneath you creates loft. Loft traps air. Air holds warmth. This principle repeats everywhere. In your clothing, in your shelter, in the snow itself. Nothing here is solid without reason. Everything allows tiny pockets of stillness. The smell inside is earthy, clean, not smoky, not sharp. This matters more than you might think. Smoke irritates lungs. Irritated lungs weaken bodies. Weak bodies struggle to stay warm. By reducing smoke exposure, these shelters quietly supported health through long winters. Modern studies on indoor air quality echo this, though applying them retroactively remains debated. You feel how the shelter encourages calm. There is no pacing, no restless movement. Energy stays stored. When someone shifts, it is small and deliberate. When you speak, it is softly. Sound carries differently here. Walls absorb it. The earth listens and keeps your secrets. There is also safety in invisibility. A low earth-covered shelter does not advertise itself. No flame flicker, no smoke plume. During times of conflict, this mattered. Warmth without visibility was survival on multiple levels. This is often overlooked in simplified retellings that focus only on comfort. As evening approaches, again the temperature outside drops. Inside, the change is barely noticeable. The ground continues releasing stored warmth. Bodies cluster. Breath thickens the air. Snow deepens overhead. You realize that warmth here is not produced. It is preserved. And as you stretch out once more, letting the earth cradle you from below, you begin to trust it. Not romantically, practically. The land holds you because you have learned how to hold it back. You begin to notice the shape of the shelter more clearly now, not by looking at it, but by feeling how the air behaves inside it. There are no sharp angles for warmth to escape into, no tall walls where heat can drift upward and vanish. Everything curves or slopes, gently guiding warmth back toward you like a slow, invisible tide. One thing researchers widely agree on is that many indigenous winter shelters favoured rounded or domed forms precisely because these shapes reduce surface area and limit heat loss. Flat walls bleed warmth, corners trap cold, curves encourage air to circulate rather than separate. You are sitting inside a lesson in quiet physics learned centuries before equations ever tried to explain it. You stretch your legs slightly and feel how little extra space there is. At first, this closeness feels unfamiliar. Then it starts to make sense. A large interior volume takes more energy to warm. A compact one responds quickly to body heat. These shelters were sized for living, not impressing. No extra room for ego. No wasted warmth drifting into empty air. There is a small detail that often gets overlooked. The ceiling is low enough that you can almost touch it when you sit upright. This is not accidental or uncomfortable to those accustomed to it. It keeps warm air close to bodies instead of hovering uselessly above. Early European observers sometimes described these interiors as cramped or primitive. What they missed was that their own tall tents leaked heat relentlessly, while these spaces quietly held it. Some specialists continue to debate whether certain shelter dimensions were culturally standardized or simply the result of trial and error passed down through families. Measurements from archaeological sites suggest both patterns existed. In harsher climates, consistency appears stronger. In milder regions, flexibility dominates. What matters is not the blueprint, but the outcome. People stayed alive. You shift again, feeling how the walls almost seem to lean inward protectively. Thick layers of earth press gently from all sides. This pressure stabilizes temperature. The shelter does not react dramatically to changes outside. Cold arrives slowly. Warmth leaves reluctantly. This lag is everything. It gives bodies time to adjust. There is a small, almost playful observation shared in some oral traditions. Children were sometimes told that a round shelter confuses the cold, giving it nowhere to hide. While not scientific in a modern sense, the metaphor stuck, and perhaps it worked. Children remembered to value shape, to respect enclosure, to understand that warmth likes to linger when given gentle boundaries. You notice how people position themselves within the space. Elders and children occupy the center. Stronger adults take the edges. This is not announced or enforced. It is simply understood. Heat radiates outward. Those most vulnerable stay where warmth is richest. This arrangement changes subtly throughout the night as people shift and share. There is also the matter of entrances. You have already felt how low and narrow they are, but now you notice their placement. They often face away from prevailing winter winds. Sometimes they are angled slightly, creating a short passage that traps cold air before it reaches the main space. You crawl through this passage and feel the temperature change almost immediately. It is like stepping through a curtain. Some academics still question whether these entrance designs were primarily thermal or defensive. Likely they serve both. A small opening is easier to protect. It is also easier to seal. Either way, it keeps warmth where it belongs. As night deepens again, you hear the wind rise outside. It scrapes across the land, testing every weakness. But here inside the rounded quiet, it fails to find a way in. The shelter hums softly with shared breath and stored heat. You pull your coverings closer, not because you are cold, but because ritual matters. Habit reinforces survival. You realize now that warmth is not just about materials, it is about geometry, about shaping space so that heat behaves kindly. These shelters do not fight the cold, they simply refuse to give it room. And as you settle back down, letting the curve of the walls cradle sound and warmth alike, you feel how design itself can be a form of care. You become more aware of the people around you now, not as individuals with names or stories, but as sources of something quietly essential. Heat, living heat. It moves without sound, without flame, passing from skin to skin, through closeness and shared stillness. You lean slightly, feel another shoulder against yours, and understand that warmth here is collective. One commonly accepted understanding among historians is that shared body heat was one of the most reliable winter survival tools available to indigenous communities living without constant fire. This was not desperation, it was design. Families slept together, extended kin gathered in the same enclosed spaces. Solitary sleeping in winter was rare and considered risky unless conditions allowed otherwise. You notice how naturally bodies arrange themselves. No one needs instruction. Children curl inward. Elders are buffered on all sides. Those strongest from the day's work sit or lie toward the edges, absorbing more cold so others do not have to. This is not sacrifice in the dramatic sense. It is routine. You feel it happen without discussion, like breathing. There is an unexpected detail that often surprises people hearing about this for the first time. Dogs were frequently included in these sleeping clusters. Not as pets in the modern sense, but as additional warmth and early warning. Their body heat mattered. Their presence mattered. Some winter accounts describe nights where the number of dogs in a shelter increased during severe cold, not for comfort but for survival. Scholars continue to question how consciously this clustering was managed. Was it planned nightly, or did it simply emerge from habits? Oral histories suggest both. Elders corrected children gently. Adults adjusted positions instinctively. Over time, bodies learned where they belonged in the thermal pattern of the group. You feel how the air changes as more people settle in. Breath adds moisture. Moisture holds warmth. The temperature rises not suddenly but steadily. It does not feel hot. It feels stable. The kind of warmth that does not shock your system, but reassures it. There is something important happening beneath the surface. Your body relaxes, muscles loosen. When the body feels safe from cold, it stops burning energy unnecessarily. This conservation is critical. Calories are not wasted shivering. Strength lasts longer. Illness is less likely to take hold. Modern physiology supports this, though applying laboratory terms to lived experience only tells part of the story. You listen to the sounds of the group, soft breaths, occasional shifts, a low murmur as someone whispers to a child. Sound itself becomes part of the warmth. Loud spaces feel exposed, quiet ones feel enclosed, protected. This silence is not emptiness. It is fullness without noise. There is a small story told in some communities about winter travelers who tried to sleep apart to prove strength, only to wake weak and trembling, while others rested comfortably together. Whether these stories are literal or cautionary hardly matters. The lesson stayed clear. Cold punishes isolation. You adjust again, drawing your knees closer. Someone else mirrors the movement. Heat flows more efficiently now. You feel it along your back, your arms, the side of your face. This is not romanticized. Bodies are bodies, sometimes awkward, sometimes restless. But survival smooths the discomfort. Some anthropologists still debate whether this communal sleeping had more impact on physical warmth or emotional resilience. Likely both. Feeling held by others reduces stress. Reduced stress supports body temperature regulation. The systems reinforce each other in ways that are difficult to separate. Outside, the wind continues its work. Inside, the group becomes its own quiet weather system. Stable, predictable, warm enough. As sleep begins to pull at you again, you realize something gently profound. Warmth here is not owned. It is shared. No one hoards it, no one earns it. It moves where it is needed most. And wrapped in that understanding, you let yourself drift, supported by the simple physics of human closeness. You wake again to the feeling of layers shifting against your skin, soft slightly, rough alive with memory. Clothing here is not an afterthought. It is architecture. It builds warmth the way walls do, one layer at a time, each serving a purpose that goes beyond simple coverage. There is broad agreement among historians that indigenous winter clothing systems were remarkably sophisticated, even without woven textiles, metal fasteners, or synthetic insulation. These garments were engineered through experience. Hide fur feathers and plant fibers were combined in ways that managed heat, moisture, and movement with quiet precision. You run your fingers along the inside of what you are wearing and feel fur turned inward. This matters. Fur traps air close to the skin. Air warms quickly and stays put when it cannot circulate freely. The outer layer, tougher hide or tightly processed skin, blocks wind and sheds snow. Together they create a breathing barrier rather than a sealed shell. There is a small but fascinating observation recorded in several regions. People often wore multiple lighter layers instead of one heavy garment. This allowed adjustment throughout the day. As you walk, you loosen layers to prevent sweating. As you rest, you draw them close again. Sweat is dangerous here. Dampness steals warmth far faster than cold air alone. Entire clothing traditions evolved around staying dry above all else. Some researchers still examine whether certain stitching techniques serve symbolic roles or purely functional ones. The way seams were placed often avoided pressure points where moisture could accumulate. Decorative elements sometimes doubled as structural reinforcement. The line between beauty and survival blurred until it disappeared. You notice how the garments move with you. There is no stiffness, no sharp edges. Everything flexes. This flexibility prevents friction and heat loss. It also allows the body to maintain circulation. Tight clothing cuts warmth off from extremities. Loose clothing lets it flow. There is a quirky detail that rarely makes it into textbooks. In some communities, winter clothing was deliberately aired in cold, dry conditions rather than warmed near a fire. Cold air removed moisture without melting snow into fabric. This preserved insulation. It feels counterintuitive until you understand that dryness is warmth. You adjust a wrap around your shoulders and feel how it overlaps rather than closes with a single point. There are no buttons to fail, no clasps to freeze. Gravity holds layers in place. Movement reinforces the seal. It is simple and resilient. Scholars continue to discuss how much variation existed between regions and how much knowledge traveled through trade and intermarriage. What is clear is that these clothing systems were not static. They evolved. Designs changed as winters changed. Materials shifted as animals migrated or plants became scarce. Adaptation never stopped. You become aware of the sound clothing makes, a soft brushing, a muted whisper. Nothing sharp, nothing loud. This matters in winter. Noise draws attention. Noise wastes energy. Quiet movement conserves both warmth and safety. You also feel how your skin responds. It is not clammy. It is not overheated. The balance holds. Your body does not panic. It does not shiver unnecessarily. This equilibrium is the goal. Not maximum warmth, but sustainable warmth. There is an old saying, recorded in some oral histories, that clothing should feel like a second shelter. Not armor, not decoration. A portable room you carry with you. As you sit here, wrapped and breathing slowly, you understand exactly what that means. Outside, the temperature continues its slow descent. Inside your layers, the change barely registers. Heat stays where it belongs. Moisture moves outward. Air stays trapped in just the right places. You watch someone nearby adjust a child's clothing, tucking fur closer to the neck, smoothing a fold along the back. This care is quiet and practiced. No one lectures, no one explains, knowledge passes through hands and habit. Modern material science often marvels at how effective these garments were without industrial tools. Some experts suggest that certain hide preparations rival modern insulation in performance. Others caution against direct comparison. What matters is that people trusted these clothes with their lives. And winter after winter, they delivered. As the day stretches forward, you stand layers settling into place, ready to move again without losing warmth. You feel protected without feeling trapped. And as you step back into the cold, wrapped in fur, feather and fiber, you realize that clothing here is not about fashion. It is about conversation between skin and season. As you move again, you become aware of something subtler than warmth itself. Your skin is not sealed away from the world. It is listening. The clothing you wear does not trap you inside a plastic shell. It allows a slow conversation between your body and the air, and that conversation keeps you alive. It is well established through historical and physiological study that the human body loses heat fastest when moisture cannot escape. Indigenous winter clothing systems accounted for this without charts or laboratories. They relied on lived feedback. If you felt damp, you adjusted. If you felt chilled, you layered. Over time, entire communities learned to sense danger before it arrived. You pause, lifting one edge of your clothing to let a small puff of warm air escape. Not too much, just enough. The goal is balance. Too sealed and sweat builds. Too open and cold rushes in. This fine-tuning becomes instinct. Children learn it by watching adults, by copying small movements that are never formally explained. There is an unusual detail noted by several early observers who paid close attention. Some garments were intentionally worn slightly loose at the wrists and ankles. This allowed minimal airflow that reduced condensation without significant heat loss. To an outsider, it looked careless. In reality, it was precision. Experts still discuss how these breathable systems compare to modern vapor barrier clothing. Some argue indigenous designs prioritized adaptability over maximum insulation. Others suggest the materials themselves created a natural regulation effect modern synthetics struggle to replicate. The conversation continues quietly in academic circles, but the lived results remain clear. You feel how your skin stays dry even as you move. Dry skin stays warmer. Blood flow remains steady. Extremities stay functional. You flex your fingers and toes and feel sensation hold strong. This matters more than comfort. Numbness leads to mistakes. Mistakes in winter compound quickly. There is a small story told in some regions about hunters who ignored early signs of dampness, out of pride refusing to stop and adjust layers. They returned weak shaking, sometimes not at all. Whether these stories are literal records or teaching tools hardly matters. The lesson passed on clearly. Moisture is the quiet enemy. You notice how often people stop even briefly to check themselves. A hand slips inside a sleeve. A shoulder rolls, adjusts airflow. A hood shifts angle. These movements are so subtle they barely register as action. Yet over hours they prevent disaster. Your breath becomes part of this system too. You breathe through fabric warming air before it enters your lungs. Cold air directly inhaled can sap core temperature and irritate airways. Simple positioning of scarves or wraps softened each breath. No metal buckles, no rigid structures, just fabric and awareness. Some specialists continue to debate whether these practices developed independently across regions or spread through cultural exchange. Evidence suggests both. What matters is that similar solutions emerged wherever cold demanded attention. The human body, given time and observation, finds patterns. You kneel briefly, feeling how heat shifts inside your clothing as your posture changes. Sitting traps warmth differently than standing. Kneeling reduces airflow around the legs. People learned these positional effects through repetition. Over time, posture became part of thermal strategy. There is also restraint involved. You do not overdress. Overdressing leads to sweat. Sweat leads to danger. It feels strange at first to step into cold, slightly underdressed, trusting movement to warm you. But you learn quickly. The body generates heat efficiently when allowed to work without being smothered. You hear the faint sound of fabric brushing fabric as others move nearby. That sound tells you something. It tells you layers are shifting, that adjustments are happening, that no one is ignoring what their skin is saying. Some modern survival instructors echo these principles, now advising people to manage layers actively, rather than seeking constant maximum warmth. They often present this as rediscovered knowledge. For the communities you are learning from, it was never lost. As the day progresses, clouds thicken. The temperature drops again. You feel it immediately, not as shock but as information. You respond without drama. A wrap tightens, a hood lowers, airflow changes, warmth stabilizes. You realize that warmth here is dynamic. It is not something you put on and forget. It requires attention, but not stress. Awareness replaces anxiety. The body becomes an instrument tuned to its environment. As evening approaches, once more, movement slows, layers settle. The system shifts from active regulation to preservation. Heat generated during the day is now guarded carefully. Clothing closes slightly, bodies cluster again. You settle back into stillness, skin dry breath, steady warmth, holding without effort. The cold remains outside, present but managed. And as you rest, you understand that survival without fire or metal did not rely on brute endurance. It relied on listening to the body, trusting its serenity to signal needs before danger arrived, and responding with calm, practiced care. You step out into a world that looks hostile, but behaves differently than you expect. Snow stretches in every direction, pale and quiet, absorbing sound, until even your own footsteps feel softened. You have been taught since childhood that snow is deadly, that it freezes and buries and kills. Yet here you begin to learn its other nature. It is widely recognized by environmental historians that snow, when undisturbed, is one of the most effective insulators found in cold climates. Countless Native American winter practices relied on this property. Snow traps air in millions of tiny pockets, slowing heat transfer. When shaped or allowed to settle naturally around shelters, it becomes a protective layer rather than a threat. You brush snow gently against the lower walls of the shelter, packing it just enough to block gaps. Not too tight, not too loose. The difference matters. Packed snow seals drafts, looser snow insulates. This balance was learned through years of trial, through watching how shelters behaved during storms, through listening to how wind sounded differently when snow settled just right. There is a curious detail passed down in several northern traditions. Children were warned not to scrape snow away from shelters without reason. Removing snow might feel tidy, but it stripped away warmth. Some elders even compared snow to a living blanket that should not be shaken off unless it threatened collapse. The image stuck and behaviour followed. Researchers still discuss how intentionally snow was used versus simply accepted. Some argue that snow insulation was an accidental benefit rather than a planned strategy. Others point to repeated patterns in shelter remains and oral teachings that suggest deliberate use. The truth likely sits between intention and adaptation. People noticed what worked and kept doing it. You kneel and scoop snow into your hands. It squeaks faintly dry and powdery. This kind of snow insulates best. Wet snow behaves differently, heavier and less effective at trapping air. Knowing the difference mattered. People read snow the way sailors read waves. Texture told stories. Sound offered warnings. You feel how the air inside the shelter remains stable, even as the outside temperature drops sharply. The snow layer slows the change. This delay gives bodies time to adjust. Sudden cold shocks the system. Gradual change allows adaptation. This principle repeats everywhere here. Nothing abrupt, nothing wasted. There is an old anecdote recorded by an early Arctic explorer who marveled that indigenous guides slept comfortably while he shivered beside a fire. He noted with some confusion that their shelters were banked with snow rather than cleared. At the time, he dismissed it as ignorance. Later, he copied the practice and survived a storm that would have otherwise killed him. Some specialists continue to examine whether snow shelters were primarily emergency solutions or part of regular winter living. Evidence suggests both. In certain regions, snow structures were temporary refuges during travel. In others, snow was integrated into longer-term shelter systems. Adaptation shifted with landscape and season. You crawl briefly into a low snow alcove formed by drifting wind. Inside, the air feels still, almost mild. Your breath fogs gently. This is not illusion. The snow blocks wind completely. Without moving air to strip heat away, your body warms the space quickly. This same principle allowed people to survive sudden storms far from permanent shelters. There is a small but telling practice associated with snow use. Entrances were often sealed loosely at night with snow blocks or packed drifts, then reopened in the morning. This reduced heat loss while allowing fresh air to circulate slowly. Carbon buildup was less of a concern without fire, but oxygen still mattered. Balance ruled everything. Scholars continue to explore how knowledge of snow behaviour varied between regions. What worked in dry northern cold did not always translate to wetter climates. Communities adapted their techniques accordingly. Snow was not treated as a universal solution, but as one tool among many. You listen as snow continues to fall, a soft hiss against the ground. Each flake adds insulation. Each layer quiets the world further. Sound dampens, movement slows. The night feels closer but not more dangerous. In fact, it feels more contained. There is also psychological comfort here. Snow creates enclosure. It reduces visual chaos. It limits sensory overload. In long winters, this mattered. Calm minds regulate body temperature more effectively. Panic accelerates heat loss. Quiet supports warmth in ways that are hard to measure, but easy to feel. You adjust your bedding again, knowing that the snow above and around you will hold steady through the night. You do not fear being buried. Shelters were designed to shed weight. Roof angles mattered. Snow load was observed carefully. Collapse was rare when knowledge guided construction. Some modern survival narratives portray snow as the ultimate enemy, something to battle aggressively. What you experience here tells a different story. Snow is neither friend nor foe. It is a condition. When understood, it becomes shelter. As you lie back down, the world outside fades into muffled stillness. Inside, warmth remains constant. Breath slows, muscles loosen. The cold stays present but distant, held back by layers of white that quietly do their work. And as sleep returns, you realize that snow did not threaten survival here. Ignorance did. Knowledge turned winter's most feared element into one of its most reliable protections. You notice it the moment you step outside again. The cold itself is not what hits you first. It is the movement of air, a sudden brush along your cheek, a tug at loose fabric. The temperature may be low, but it is the wind that steals warmth with intent. Here you learn quickly that still air is survivable, while moving air is merciless. Many winter survival traditions across indigenous North America were built around one simple, widely acknowledged reality. Wind accelerates heat loss faster than temperature alone. Entire shelter systems, travel habits and daily routines evolved to neutralize airflow rather than chase warmth directly. You are not trying to be warm, you are trying to be unreachable. You turn your body slightly, angling your shoulders away from the breeze. This is automatic now. Facing wind head-on wastes heat. Turning with it reduces exposure. You notice others doing the same, adjusting posture without thinking. Movement becomes fluid, almost dance-like, guided by sensation rather than instruction. There is a small, almost amusing detail noted in several oral traditions. Children were sometimes taught to imagine the wind as a clever thief that only steals when you look straight at it. Turn your back and it loses interest. The image made children remember to shift their stance instinctively. Whether playful or practical, the habit saved energy. You approach the shelter again and notice how it sits low against the land. Not perched, not elevated. It hugs the ground, letting wind pass overhead rather than into living space. Trees and terrain break gusts before they reach you. Even a slight rise in earth makes a difference. Wind flows like water. It follows paths of least resistance. These shelters interrupt those paths. Researchers still examine how deliberately wind patterns were mapped when selecting winter camp locations. Some evidence suggests long-term observation across generations. Other evidence points to seasonal adjustment, with camps shifting slightly year to year depending on prevailing winds. The exact balance between planning and responsiveness remains open to interpretation. You feel how clothing changes in wind. Fabric that worked moments ago now needs adjustment. You pull a wrap closer. Someone nearby tightens a hood. Wind sneaks through openings and carries warmth away invisibly. Blocking airflow matters more than adding layers in this moment. There is a fringe observation from early traders who noticed that indigenous travellers often paused briefly behind rocks or brush lines, even when in a hurry. These pauses were not rest stops, they were windbreaks. 30 seconds of shelter could prevent minutes of heat loss later. Modern hikers do the same now, often without realizing the origin of the habit. You listen to the sound of wind against different surfaces. Over open snow it whispers. Against packed earth it hums. Around trees it breaks into uneven pulses. Sound tells you where wind is strongest. Your ears become tools. You choose routes that minimize exposure, even if they take longer. Some specialists continue to debate whether wind avoidance was more critical than insulation in certain regions. In open plains, wind management dominated survival strategies. In forested areas, insulation took priority. What remains consistent is attention. No one ignored the air. You lower yourself closer to the ground while moving. Standing tall increases surface area. Crouching reduces it. Even slight changes matter. You watch others instinctively shorten their stride, reduce arm swing, and keep movements compact. This conserves heat and limits airflow across skin. There is also restraint involved. You do not fight wind aggressively. Leaning hard against it burns energy and creates sweat. Instead, you let it pass while you slip through quieter pockets of space. Patience replaces resistance. You return inside, sealing the entrance carefully behind you. The difference is immediate. Stillness returns. Warmth stabilizes. You realize how thin the line is between comfort and danger. A poorly placed opening, a moment of inattention. Wind finds it and takes what it wants. As night approaches again, wind strengthens outside, testing every edge. Inside, bodies cluster tighter. Openings are checked. Snow is packed just enough to block drafts without suffocating air. Balance holds. You settle back into place, listening to the wind fail again and again to reach you. It rushes past. It circles. It moves on. Here it cannot steal what it cannot touch. And as you rest, you understand that cold does not always attack loudly. Sometimes it whispers through moving air. Those who survived learn to listen for that whisper and answer it with stillness, shelter, and quiet intelligence. You begin to understand that night is not just something you endure. It is something you prepare for, with intention, especially when warmth depends on how you meet the ground. As evening settles again, the focus shifts from movement to rest, and rest here is anything but passive. One widely accepted insight drawn from winter living across many indigenous cultures is that sleeping position and ground preparation mattered as much as clothing or shelter. Cold seeps upward relentlessly. The earth gives warmth slowly, but it can also take it back just as quietly if you let it. You learn not to let it. You lower yourself onto layers arranged carefully long before night arrives. Dried grasses form the base, springy and full of trapped air. Above them, reeds or bark create separation. Sometimes hides rest on top. The goal is loft, space between you and the ground. Direct contact is avoided whenever possible. This is not about softness, it is about insulation. There is a lesser-known observation noted in several winter encampments. People often slept slightly curled rather than fully stretched out. This reduced exposed surface area and kept extremities closer to the core. It also allowed shared coverings to overlap more effectively. You feel how your knees draw in naturally, how your spine relaxes into the curve. Some historians continue to question whether specific sleeping postures were taught explicitly or absorbed through imitation. There are no manuals left behind. What remains are patterns, consistent arrangements of bedding, repeated wear marks on shelter floors. The body leaves its own records. You notice how heads are positioned. Faces often turn inward toward the warmest part of the group, or toward the shelter wall rather than the entrance. Breathing into enclosed suck gently warms the air around the face. It also reduces direct exposure to drafts. Small differences add up over hours. There is a quietly intriguing detail shared in a few oral accounts. Some elders discouraged sleeping flat on the back during extreme cold, believing it allowed heat to escape more freely from the chest and abdomen. While modern science debates the thermal impact of this, the practice persisted because people felt warmer sleeping on their side or slightly curled. You shift once, then settle. Movement during sleep is minimal. Restlessness wastes energy. Energy is warmth. Children are soothed early, encouraged to stay still. Stories are told softly until breathing slows. Sleep arrives gradually, not abruptly. You listen to the night sounds again. Wind moves above, snow settles. Inside, the rhythm of breathing synchronizes. The shelter becomes a single organism conserving heat. No one wakes without reason. Waking means losing warmth. Some scholars still explore how sleep cycles adapted to long winter nights. Evidence suggests people slept longer with fewer interruptions. Short wakeful moments occurred, but extended nighttime activity was rare. The body conserved fuel, dreams stretched. You feel how your own body responds. Muscles relax deeper, heart rate slows, heat production drops slightly, but heat loss drops more. The balance holds. You are not hot, you are not cold, you are steady. There is also trust involved. Trust that bedding was prepared correctly. Trust that others will maintain the shelter. Trust that the entrance remains sealed. This shared responsibility allows true rest. Without it, the body stays alert and burns warmth unnecessarily. You wake briefly sometime later. Not from cold, but from quiet. The kind of quiet that only deep snow brings. You adjust one layer, barely opening your eyes, then settle again. The system holds. In modern life, sleeping warm often means machines humming through the night. Here, warmth depends on arrangement, awareness and restraint. No switches, no sudden heat, just continuity. As your breathing evens out again, you realize how much wisdom lives in something as ordinary as how you lie down. Survival is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a well-chosen patch of ground, layered, carefully, trusted, fully. And with that understanding, sleep deepens, carrying you gently through the longest hours of cold. Morning does not arrive with urgency. It seeps in slowly, pale light pressing gently against the shelter walls. You do not leap up to shake off the cold. That would waste warmth you spent all night preserving. Instead, you lie still for a moment, letting your body decide when it is ready to move. Across many Native American communities, there existed a shared understanding that movement itself was a form of heat, but only when used carefully. Activity generated warmth, yes, but reckless motion produced sweat, and sweat invited danger. The goal was controlled motion, never frantic exertion. You rise when stiffness fades, not before. You begin with small movements. Fingers flex inside fur. Toes curl and uncurl. Joints wake gently. This gradual approach allows blood flow to increase without overwhelming your body. It feels almost meditative. There is no rush. Cold punishes haste more reliably than laziness. You step outside eventually, but not far. Tasks are chosen with intention. Firewood gathering, when it occurred in some regions, was brief and strategic. Without reliance on constant flame, there was no endless chopping. Instead, you walk, check traps, adjust shelter edges, stamp snow lightly to maintain structure. Each movement has purpose. There is an intriguing observation recorded in several early winter accounts. People often preferred steady walking over standing still, even when resting. Slow pacing kept muscles warm without inducing sweat. Standing motionless in cold air allowed wind to strip heat quickly. You feel this difference immediately. A gentle rhythm keeps warmth circulating. Scholars continue to examine how daily routines shifted seasonally to reduce unnecessary exposure. In winter, tasks clustered tightly around shelter areas. Long journeys were planned carefully or postponed. Energy was budgeted like food. Every step counted. You notice how posture changes while moving. Shoulders remain relaxed. Arms stay close to the body. Large gestures disappear. This compact movement reduces airflow across skin and fabric. It also conserves energy. Over time, these habits shape the body itself. Movements become economical, efficient. There is a curious teaching, remembered in some oral traditions, where elders told young people to move like animals in winter, not fast, not slow, just enough. Animals do not sprint endlessly through snow. They choose paths, they pause, they conserve. Humans learn to mirror this wisdom. You feel hunger begin to stir, but meals are not heavy yet. Large meals draw blood inward for digestion, sometimes making extremities feel colder. Instead, small portions warm you gradually. This rhythm supports sustained activity rather than spikes of heat followed by chill. You return inside briefly, not because you are cold, but because the wind has shifted. Attention stays sharp. Conditions change. You adapt. There is no complaint, no dramatization. Cold is information. Some historians still debate how much of this movement philosophy was consciously taught versus culturally absorbed. Children watched adults. Adults corrected gently. Over time, the body learned before the mind needed to understand. You sit again, breathing slow, letting warmth stabilize. The shelter holds. The ground supports. Clothing breathes. Nothing fights the cold. Everything accommodates it. As the day progresses, movement increases slightly as the sun rises higher. Work happens in bursts, followed by rest. This pattern prevents exhaustion and preserves warmth. You feel steady rather than drained. Modern fitness culture often celebrates constant motion. Here, motion is selective, purposeful. You move when it helps warmth and stop when it threatens it. This balance is subtle and learned through experience rather than instruction. By afternoon, you realize you have been warm most of the day without ever feeling hot. Your body feels capable, present, alert without tension. This is not survival by endurance. It is survival by restraint. As light begins to fade again, activity slows naturally. Tasks wind down. Bodies cluster back toward shelter. The cycle continues. You settle once more, understanding now that warmth is not a static state. It is a rhythm, a dance between movement and stillness, guided by attention and respect for limits. And as evening returns, you feel ready, not because the cold has softened, but because you have learned how to move within it without giving anything away. As the day settles into its quieter middle hours, your attention turns inward toward a source of warmth that never flickers or fades. Food. Not fire, not friction, but the slow internal burn that begins in the stomach and spreads outward with patience. Here, eating is not just nourishment, it is thermal planning. It is broadly understood by researchers studying indigenous winter lifeways that diet played a crucial role in maintaining body heat. Foods rich in fat and protein were especially valued during cold months because they produced sustained warmth through digestion. This was not accidental preference, it was seasonal intelligence. Lean foods belonged to warmer times. Winter called for density. Winter called for, you feel it after eating. Not a rush of heat, but a steady glow that builds gradually. Blood moves inward to support digestion, warming the core. From there, heat radiates outward, slowly reaching limbs, without shocking the system. This kind of warmth lasts. It does not spike and crash. There is an unexpected detail found in several winter food traditions. Meals were often timed later in the day, closer to nightfall. Eating shortly before rest helped maintain core temperature through the coldest hours. You lie down afterward, feeling stable rather than hungry, allowing sleep to deepen without the distraction of cold. Some scholars still debate how consciously this timing was understood, in physiological terms, versus learned through observation. People noticed patterns. Nights were easier after certain meals. Hunger made sleep shallow and cold unbearable. Over generations, timing became tradition. You notice portion size matters too. Overeating makes the body sluggish and can lead to sweating, which cools the skin once digestion slows. Undereating leaves nothing to burn. Balance is everything. Meals are filling, but not heavy, satisfying without excess. There is a curious anecdote from early contact periods describing visitors who rejected fatty winter foods as unappealing only to suffer badly from cold exhaustion. When they finally adopted local diets, their tolerance improved dramatically. What seemed strange at first turned out to be essential. You sit quietly after eating, allowing digestion to do its work. Movement pauses, conversation softens. This rest is intentional. Digesting food generates heat, but moving too much pulls blood away from the core. Stillness lets warmth spread evenly. Experts examining winter survival often emphasize shelter and clothing first, but internal heat production deserves equal respect. Without fuel, even the best insulation fails. Bodies become hollow spaces where cold settles easily. You feel how this warmth differs from external heat. It does not dry the air. It does not sting skin. It feels integrated. Yours. The kind of warmth that makes you breathe slower without thinking about it. There is also ritual tied to winter eating. Certain foods are saved specifically for cold nights. Sharing matters. A well-fed group maintains warmth more effectively than individuals eating alone. Hunger weakens community, just as cold weakens bodies. Some anthropologists continue to explore how spiritual meaning intertwined with winter food practices. Fat-rich animals were often treated with reverence, their role in sustaining life through winter, acknowledged through story and ritual. Whether symbolic or practical, the respect reinforced careful use and sharing. As evening approaches again, you feel the warmth from your meal still present, steady and reliable. Clothing layers adjust slightly. Bodies draw closer, shelter seals itself against the dark. You realize now that warmth without fire is not a single trick. It is a network. Shelter holds heat, clothing manages it, movement regulates it, food generates it. Each part supports the others. Remove one and the system strains. You settle back feeling the internal glow carry you into rest. Outside, the cold waits patiently. Inside, nourishment does its quiet work. And as sleep begins to pull you under once more, you understand that survival here was not about denying the body's needs, but about meeting them precisely at the right time with deep attention. You begin to notice that time itself behaves differently in winter. The sun rises low and lingers briefly, as if unsure whether the effort is worth it. Shadows stretch long, even at midday. Here, staying warm depends not just on what you do, but when you do it. Timing becomes a form of insulation. Across many indigenous winter traditions, there was a clear recognition that temperature followed rhythms. Cold deepened before dawn eased slightly. After sunrise peaked in the late afternoon, then slid downward again after sunset. Daily life bent itself around these cycles. You do not fight them, you ride them. You wait before leaving shelter in the morning, letting the faint warmth of daylight do its work. Even a small rise in temperature makes a difference when margins are thin. Tasks that require stillness are postponed until the warmest hours. Tasks that require movement are done earlier when motion itself offsets the cold. There is a quietly accepted historical understanding that winter schedules shortened and compressed. Days became simpler, fewer tasks, clear priorities. Activities that could wait did wait. This was not laziness, it was discipline. Energy saved in the morning meant warmth preserved at night. You feel this rhythm settle into your body. You stop checking the sky impatiently. You let light arrive when it arrives. When clouds block the sun, plans shift without complaint. Flexibility is safety. A small but telling detail appears in several oral histories. Elders often warned against travelling at twilight in winter, not because it was forbidden, but because temperature drops fastest during that transition. People who lingered too long outside during dusk risked losing heat. Just before night demanded conservation. The lesson was practical, and it stuck. Some scholars continue to discuss how precise these temperature observations were. Did people track them consciously, or did habit do the work? Evidence suggests both. Language itself encoded time and temperature together. Certain words implied not just light level, but cold intensity. Time was felt, not measured. You notice how meals align with this cycle too. Light eating earlier, heavier nourishment later. Warmth generated by digestion is timed to the coldest hours. Sleep follows fullness. Waking follows light. The system loops gently. You listen to how sound changes with temperature. Snow crunches louder in deep cold. Air feels sharper. Even voices carry differently. These cues tell you when conditions are shifting. You respond without needing numbers. There is a quirky observation from early winter journals, describing indigenous guides refusing to rush even when outsiders urged speed. They waited for a slight temperature rise before moving. What looked like delay turned out to be efficiency. Arriving warm mattered more than arriving early. You sit again during the warmest part of the day, allowing heat to stabilize inside, clothing and shelter. This pause banks warmth. Later, when cold returns, you draw on it like savings. Researchers still debate how much of this timing knowledge was universal versus region-specific. In some climates, the warmest window was brief. In others, it stretched longer. What remained constant was attention. People watched patterns and adjusted. As afternoon fades, you begin preparing for night early. Bedding is checked, shelter edges are sealed, clothing is dried and adjusted. Nothing waits until dark. Darkness steals options, preparation preserves them. You feel how your own internal clock begins to sync with the land. Fatigue arrives earlier, alertness peaks when it needs to. There is no artificial light to fight the rhythm. You move with it instead. Modern life often ignores these subtle cycles, flattening time with constant light and heat. Here, time has texture. It cools and warms, it asks you to listen. As night approaches once more, you are ready not because you are stronger, but because you acted at the right moments. Warmth has been protected all day long, one decision at a time. And as you settle back into shelter, you understand that surviving winter without fire or metal was not just about materials. It was about timing life itself to the quiet pulse of cold. You begin to notice how attention shifts when the most vulnerable members of the group move. Children do not wander far. Elders are never left at the edges for long. Warmth here is not distributed evenly by accident. It is guided by care, memory, and quiet agreement. Across many indigenous winter communities, there was a deeply rooted understanding that protecting children and elders from cold was a collective responsibility. This is not sentimentality, it is strategy. Elders carried knowledge, children carried the future. Losing either weakened survival far beyond a single season. You watch how spaces rearrange themselves when an elder settles down. People shift without comment, bodies close ranks, the warmest central spots become available. No one announces this. It simply happens, reinforced by generations of habit. Heat flows toward those who need it most. There is a small but telling practice remembered in several winter traditions. Children were often placed between adults, while sleeping not only for safety but for warmth. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster. Surrounding them stabilized temperature. Over time, children learned this pattern and later replicated it for others. Some historians continue to discuss whether these arrangements were consciously organized or culturally automatic. Oral history suggests both. Elders corrected placement gently when needed. Most of the time, bodies knew where to go before words were necessary. You notice how elders move less, conserving energy. Tasks requiring exposure are taken on by those best able to generate heat through motion. This division is not rigid. It shifts with health and season. What matters is responsiveness. Roles adapt. There is a curious detail shared in a few accounts where elders wore slightly heavier clothing, even indoors. This was not indulgence. Aging bodies generate heat less efficiently. Additional insulation compensated. Younger adults dressed lighter to avoid sweat. Balance extended across generations. Scholars still debate how much winter mortality rates were influenced by these communal protections versus environmental factors alone. While data is incomplete, patterns suggest that social structure played a significant role. Communities that cared for their vulnerable endured longer. You listen to the tone of voices used with children during winter. Softer, slower, calm voices prevent panic. Panic accelerates heat loss. Emotional regulation becomes thermal regulation. Comfort matters physically. You also see children learning by doing. They help pack snow. They gather grasses. They watch how clothing is adjusted. Lessons are not delivered as lectures. They are absorbed through repetition and proximity. There is an old teaching, remembered in some regions, that says, winter is when the group breathes as one. This is not metaphorical. Shared breathing warms enclosed air. Shared rhythm calms the body. Calm bodies conserve warmth better than anxious ones. You notice how elders tell stories during the longest nights. Not loudly, not dramatically. Stories distract from cold. They steady breathing. They anchor attention inward rather than outward, toward discomfort. Some anthropologists suggest storytelling served both cultural and physiological roles. The exact balance remains discussed. You feel yourself relax as the group settles. The shelter grows quieter. Children drift towards sleep, first nestled between warmth and familiarity. Elders follow, breathing deep and slow. Those still awake remain alert but calm, maintaining the space. Modern survival narratives often focus on individual grit. What you experience here tells a different story. Warmth without fire was rarely an individual achievement. It was communal engineering. As night deepens, you adjust slightly, making space where needed. A small movement, a shared blanket, a shift of weight. These actions seem minor, but they carry the group through the coldest hours. You rest again, aware now that warmth is not just about physics or biology. It is about relationships, about paying attention to who needs more and responding without being asked. And as sleep returns, wrapped in shared heat and shared care, you understand that survival here was never solitary. It was held together by people watching over one another through the long winter dark. You start to notice how carefully everyone treats moisture, as if it was something alive and dangerous. Not dramatic, not obvious, just quietly threatening. Cold alone is uncomfortable. Cold plus dampness. Dampness is deadly. This difference is understood here, with a clarity that comes only from experience. It is broadly recognized in studies of winter survival that staying dry matters more than staying warm. Indigenous communities learned this long before the language to explain it existed. Wet skin pulls heat away rapidly. Damp clothing collapses insulation. Once moisture takes hold, warmth bleeds out no matter how well you are sheltered. You feel it immediately when a snowflake melts against your wrist. It is not painfully cold, just insistent. You brush it away without thinking. Small actions prevent large problems. This habit repeats everywhere. Snow is shaken off before entering shelters. Footwear is adjusted. Clothing is aired when conditions allow. There is a subtle practice you observe during the day. People avoid sitting directly on snow or damp ground unless necessary. Even brief contact can wick heat away. Instead, they place something between themselves and the earth. Bark, hide, a bundle of grasses, anything that interrupts moisture transfer. Some historians continue to examine how moisture management shaped clothing design. Seams were placed where water was least likely to pool. Overlapping layers shed snow rather than catching it. Garments opened in ways that allowed steam to escape without letting cold rush in. Whether these choices were deliberate or evolved through use remains debated, but their effectiveness is undeniable. You notice how feet receive special attention. Wet feet chill the entire body. Footwear is changed if damp. Inner layers are dried using body heat during rest. Feet are massaged gently to restore circulation. These moments are quiet and routine, not dramatic rescues. There is a quirky detail mentioned in several winter accounts. Some people carried small bundles of dry grasses specifically to absorb moisture inside footwear. These could be swapped out as needed, keeping feet dry without fire. Simple, portable, effective. Scholars still discuss how people dried clothing in environments without heat sources. The answer turns out to be patience and airflow. Garments were hung where moving air could carry moisture away without freezing it into the fabric. Cold, dry air is an excellent drying agent. This feels counterintuitive until you experience it. You stand briefly outside, letting a wrap loosen just enough for moisture to escape. You do not wait long. Drying is gradual, rushing risks freezing. Everything is moderated. You also learn to manage sweat proactively. Movement stays measured. Layers open slightly during exertion. People stop before overheating. Sweat prevention is easier than sweat correction. This awareness becomes second nature. There is an old teaching remembered in some regions that says, "Cold forgives mistakes, but water does not." Whether metaphor or memory, the message sticks. You watch people respond instantly to dampness even before cold becomes noticeable. You listen to the sounds inside the shelter at night. Clothing rustles softly as people adjust layers to vent moisture. Breath condenses faintly, then dissipates. Air moves slowly. Nothing feels clammy. This dryness supports warmth more effectively than any single layer. Modern cold weather gear often focuses on insulation first and moisture control second. Here the priorities reverse. Dryness creates warmth. Warmth maintains dryness. The cycle reinforces itself. As the night deepens again, you feel confident, not because the cold has eased, but because moisture has been kept at bay. Your skin feels dry, your clothing feels alive with trapped air. Heat stays where it belongs. You settle into rest once more, aware now that winter survival without fire depended on vigilance more than toughness. Paying attention to small discomforts prevented large dangers. Dryness was not comfort, it was survival. And as you drift towards sleep, you understand that the cold did not defeat people here. Neglect did. Awareness practiced daily kept warmth intact through the longest nights. You begin to notice the air itself as something active, something shaped and changed by every breath taken inside the shelter. Without fire, without smoke, the air remains clean, but it does not remain neutral. It warms, it thickens slightly, it becomes familiar. Breathing here is not just survival, it is part of the heating system. There is a well-supported understanding among researchers that enclosed winter shelters without fire developed a stable internal microclimate over time. Human breath releases warmth and moisture, and in a sealed but ventilated space, this slowly raises interior temperature without stripping oxygen. This balance was carefully maintained through shelter design rather than technology. You feel it when you breathe in. The air no longer stings your lungs. It feels softened as though it has already passed through someone else before reaching you. That is because it has. Shared breath warms, shared space. Each exhale contributes something small but meaningful. There is an intriguing observation found in several early winter accounts. People often slept with faces turned toward the interior rather than toward entrances, even when lying near them. This reduced exposure to colder incoming air and allowed breath to circulate where it was most useful. Whether this was taught explicitly or learned through comfort remains an open question. You listen to the rhythm of breathing around you, slow, even, coordinated without effort. When breathing slows, the body conserves heat. Rapid breathing cools the core. Calm breath keeps warmth inside. This connection between breath and temperature is now recognized in physiology, but here it was lived knowledge. Some scholars continue to debate how ventilation was managed without fire. Too much ceiling risks stale air. Too much opening leaks warmth. Shelter designs solved this by allowing slow air exchange near ground level while trapping warmer air above. You feel fresh air enter gently near your legs, warming before it reaches your chest. There is a small but memorable detail shared in a few oral traditions. Children were sometimes told that loud breathing lets the cold hear you. The metaphor encouraged quiet, steady breaths. In practice, it reduced hyperventilation and heat loss. Playful language reinforced serious outcomes. You notice how no one breathes directly into coverings. Fabric near the mouth can trap moisture and freeze, pulling heat away from the face. Instead, breath moves into open space where it dissipates safely. This awareness is subtle but constant. You shift slightly and feel how air responds. Movement stirs it. Too much movement cools it. Stillness lets warmth accumulate. The shelter rewards calm behavior. It punishes restlessness quietly. There is an ongoing discussion among anthropologists about whether people understood carbon dioxide buildup in enclosed spaces. While they did not use modern terms, they clearly understood comfort thresholds. If air felt heavy or made breathing uncomfortable, small adjustments were made. Entrances loosened, vent gaps opened briefly, balance returned. You feel the temperature hold steady even as the night deepens. Breath continues. Heat builds slowly. Moisture is managed by airflow and absorption into walls and bedding. Nothing condenses heavily, nothing drips. The system works because every element plays a role. You also notice sound again. Quiet breathing creates quiet space. Loud shelters invite alertness. Quiet shelters invite rest. This psychological calm supports physical warmth. Tension burns energy. Relaxation preserves it. In modern heated spaces, air often dries aggressively, irritating skin and lungs. Here, humidity remains gentle, enough to hold warmth, not enough to chill. This middle ground is difficult to engineer artificially. It emerged naturally through lived design. As sleep draws closer again, your breath slows further. You are barely aware of it now. The air feels like part of you, rather than something you fight against. It supports you, holds you. You realize that warmth without fire depended on more than walls and clothing. It depended on breath shared wisely, on knowing when to seal space and when to let it breathe. And as you drift deeper into rest, breathing steady and unhurried, you understand that even something as ordinary as air became a partner in survival, shaped gently by human presence through the long, cold night. You notice how sound behaves at night, how it thins and stretches in the cold. Every noise seems to travel farther, sharper, yet inside the shelter sound softens, as if wrapped in the same layers that hold warmth. Listening becomes part of staying alive. It is generally accepted among scholars of winter lifeways that nighttime behaviour shifted dramatically during cold months. After dark, unnecessary movement and noise were minimised. This was partly about safety, but it was also about warmth. Sound carries movement. Movement stirs air. Stirred air steals heat. Quiet keeps the air still. You lie there, eyes closed, listening. Outside, the wind hums low against snow and earth. Occasionally a branch creaks or ice shifts. Inside, there is little more than breathing and the faint rustle of fur as someone adjusts. This silence is not emptiness. It is containment. There is a small detail remembered in several oral traditions where elders cautioned against whispering too much at night in winter. Not because conversation was forbidden, but because talking cooled the body and disrupted shared air warmth. Stories belong to early evening. Night belonged to rest. Some historians still debate whether these quiet nights were driven more by thermal necessity or by cultural emphasis on rest. Likely both played a role. What is clear is that long silent nights allowed bodies to conserve energy and heat simultaneously. You feel how stillness deepens warmth. When no one moves, air layers settle. Heat pulls gently near bodies. The shelter becomes a sealed pocket of calm. Even your thoughts slow drawn into the quiet. There is a quirky observation noted by a few early winter travellers who described indigenous shelters as feeling warmer when everyone slept at once. When people stayed awake, talking or shifting, the space cooled. They did not understand why at the time. Now lying here, you do. Rest is insulation. You also become aware of how sound outside signals changes in weather. A sharper wind means colder air moving in. A muffled stillness means heavy snow. These sounds inform subtle adjustments before discomfort arrives. Someone packs snow near an edge. Another adjusts the entrance. No one announces it. Action follows listening. Researchers still discuss how much of this listening was conscious. Did people actively interpret sound, or did instinct do the work? Evidence suggests that, over generations, bodies learned to respond automatically. Cold trained attention. You notice how even coughing is suppressed gently. Not forced, simply discouraged. Dry throats are soothed early to prevent nighttime disturbance. Care for one person protects warmth for all. The shelter seems to breathe with the group. Quiet deepens. Breathing synchronizes. The world narrows to warmth and soundless space. Outside, winter continues its work, but it feels distant now, almost irrelevant. Modern nights are filled with noise. Machines hum, lights buzz. Here, silence is not absence. It is protection. It keeps warmth intact and minds calm. As sleep pulls you deeper, sound fades entirely. You are held by quiet as much as by fur and earth. Your body slips into rest without resistance. And in this near-perfect stillness, you understand that surviving winter without fire or metal required not only physical knowledge, but an intimacy with silence itself. Listening when needed, letting go when rest mattered most. You wake to nothing urgent, nothing sharp, just a faint awareness of yourself inside your body. This, you begin to realize, is not accidental. Calm is not a side effect of warmth here. Calm is part of how warmth is kept. There is a well-supported understanding among modern researchers studying cold exposure that stress accelerates heat loss, anxiety tightens muscles, disrupts breathing, and burns energy quickly. Long before this was measured, indigenous winter practices quietly reduced panic as a matter of survival. Emotional control was not abstract wisdom, it was thermal discipline. You feel how steady breathing keeps your core warm, slow inhales, longer exhales. The body responds by conserving heat rather than dumping it into frantic motion. No one hyperventilates here, no one jolts awake unless something truly demands it. There is a small but memorable teaching, preserved in several winter oral traditions, where fear is described as opening holes in the body that cold can enter. The language is symbolic, but the effect is real. Fear makes you move suddenly. Fear makes you sweat. Fear makes you waste warmth. Historians still explore whether these teachings were consciously framed as survival psychology or simply embedded in spiritual language. Either way, the result was practical. People learned to stay composed even when conditions worsened. Composure preserved heat. You notice how children are comforted quickly if they stir. A gentle touch, a murmur. Panic never has time to build. Elders understand that one frightened child can disturb the warmth of many. Calm spreads faster than fear when guided early. You feel how your muscles remain loose rather than clenched. Tension burns energy without producing useful heat. Relaxed muscles allow blood to circulate efficiently. Fingers stay warmer, toes stay responsive. Calm has a physical signature. There is a curious account from an early winter observer who noted that indigenous guides appeared almost indifferent to extreme cold, not because they felt nothing, but because they refused to dramatize discomfort. He mistook this for stoicism. In reality, it was management. Attention went to what mattered. Everything else was ignored. Some scholars continue to debate how much winter calm was culturally reinforced versus biologically adaptive. Long-term exposure may have trained nervous systems to respond differently to cold stress. Cultural teachings then amplified this adaptation. The boundary between nature and nurture remains blurred. You listen again to the quiet. Silence supports calm. Calm supports warmth. The system loops back on itself. Even your thoughts slow, becoming less jagged, less demanding. There is no mental racing here. Racing thoughts generate restless bodies. You feel how shelter design supports this mental state. Rounded walls, low light, enclosure without confinement. Everything signals safety. The body believes it. Belief changes physiology. Modern survival advice often emphasizes grit and toughness. What you experience here is different. Strength shows itself as restraint. Endurance shows itself as patience. Calm is not weakness, it is insulation. You wake briefly when someone shifts nearby, then settle again without tension. No spike of alertness, no adrenaline rush. Warmth remains intact, sleep resumes easily. As the night continues, you realize that surviving winter without fire required not only knowing what to do, but knowing how to feel. Panic could undo hours of careful warmth management in minutes. Calm preserved it effortlessly. And as you drift deeper into rest, breathing slow, and even you understand that the mind was as carefully trained as the body. In the cold thinking, softly kept heat close. When you think you understand how winter works here, the land reminds you that no single method fits everywhere. The cold does not arrive the same way in forests as it does on open plains. Mountains speak differently than coasts, and yet across vast distances people found ways to stay warm using the same quiet principles shaped to local conditions. It is firmly established through archaeological and ethnographic work that Native American cold survival strategies varied widely by region, even when fire and metal were limited or absent. In dense forests, wind was softened by trees, allowing shelters to focus more on insulation. On open plains, wind ruled everything, and shelters hugged the earth with obsessive care. In the far north, snow itself became a building material. In milder coastal zones, moisture control dominated every decision. You picture yourself moving between these places. In wooded regions, shelters nestle among trunks and brush using natural windbreaks to reduce heat loss. Bark and plant fiber play larger roles in clothing. The land offers materials that breathe while still holding warmth. Sound is dampened by trees. The cold feels quieter here. On the plains, everything changes. Wind scours relentlessly. Shelters sit lower, entrances turn away from prevailing gusts, and movement becomes even more deliberate. You learn quickly that standing tall is a mistake. You crouch, you travel in shallow folds of land. Even small rises become precious refuge. In northern regions, snow becomes unavoidable and essential. Structures adapt to heavy accumulation. Roof angles steepen, insulation deepens, clothing thickens, travel shortens. Knowledge concentrates on reading snow conditions accurately. Powder means one thing, crust means another. Each demands a different response. There is a fascinating observation shared by several early travellers who moved between regions with indigenous guides. Techniques that worked beautifully in one area failed completely in another. Guides adjusted constantly, discarding habits that no longer served. This flexibility was not weakness, it was intelligence. Researchers still examine how much of this regional variation developed independently versus spreading through trade and inter-community contact. Evidence suggests long-distance knowledge exchange played a role. Materials, stories, and practices moved along trade routes. At the same time, local adaptation always took priority. No one copied blindly. You feel this adaptability in your own behaviour now. You no longer expect a single answer to cold. You ask questions instead. What is the wind doing here? What does the ground offer? What materials are available? The environment becomes a conversation rather than an obstacle. There is a small but telling detail preserved in several regional accounts. People travelling across unfamiliar terrain often relied heavily on local hosts to teach winter habits quickly. Outsiders who refused to adjust suffered. Those who listened survived. Pride was colder than snow. Some scholars continue to debate whether regional specialization reduced overall resilience or increased it. Did focusing on local techniques limit flexibility, or did deep environmental knowledge strengthen adaptability? Evidence leans toward the latter. Knowing one place deeply taught people how to learn the next. You imagine returning to shelter in each region. The shapes differ, the materials change, but the feeling remains familiar. Enclosure, stillness, shared warmth. The principles stay constant even when the expressions vary. Modern narratives often flatten indigenous knowledge into a single story. What you experience instead is diversity. Hundreds of solutions responding to specific landscapes, all guided by attention rather than domination. As evening settles again, you feel gratitude for this flexibility. Winter is not predictable. Storms shift, temperatures swing. Survival depends on noticing change and responding without attachment to old habits. You rest with this understanding now. Warmth does not come from copying a single method perfectly. It comes from learning how to adjust, how to respect difference. And as sleep approaches once more, you realize that the greatest winter skill was not any one technique, but the ability to read the land wherever you were and let it teach you how to stay alive. You find yourself watching animals more closely now, not out of curiosity, but because they seem to know something you do not. They move through the cold without complaint, without shelters that look like shelters, without clothing you would recognize, and yet they remain warm enough. Observing them becomes another quiet lesson in survival. It is a well-established conclusion in ethnohistorical research that many indigenous winter strategies were shaped by close observation of animals. People watched how creatures rested where they nested, how they oriented their bodies to wind and snow. These were not metaphors. They were field notes written in fur and motion. You notice how animals rarely sleep exposed. They choose depressions. They turn their backs to wind. They tuck extremities in close. These behaviors mirror what you have learned. Curling inward reduces surface area. Stillness preserves heat. Shelter does not need walls if the land provides shape. There is a curious anecdote passed down in several regions where elders encourage children to watch how deer bed down in snow. Deer scrape away loose powder until they reach firmer layers, then settle into shallow hollows that block wind. Humans copied this technique when resting during travel, creating quick shelters without tools. Some historians still debate how directly animal behavior influenced human shelter design versus how both responded independently to the same environmental pressures. Did people imitate animals, or did shared physics lead to similar solutions? The question remains open, but the parallels are difficult to ignore. You watch birds fluff their feathers, increasing airspace around their bodies. This loft traps warmth efficiently. Humans did the same with fur and layered clothing. You see foxes curl their tails over their noses, warming inhaled air. Scarves and wraps echo this behavior almost exactly. There is a small but memorable detail recorded by early naturalists who lived among indigenous communities. They noted that people sometimes chose resting spots where animals had already gathered, not because of superstition, but because animals selected warm microclimates instinctively. Following them reduced guesswork. Scholars continue to explore how much of this animal-based knowledge was taught explicitly. Oral histories suggest elders pointed out these behaviors casually rather than formally. Lessons arrived as observations, not commands. Over time, watching animals became second nature. You feel this awareness settle into you now. You no longer rush to impose human solutions. You pause and look around first. Where does snow drift less? Where does wind slow? Where has life already chosen to pause? Answers appear quietly. Animals also conserve energy ruthlessly. They do not waste movement. They sleep longer, they eat when needed, and rest when possible. This rhythm aligns perfectly with human winter strategies you have already learned. Survival favors restraint across species. Modern culture often frames humans as separate from nature. Here, separation dissolves. You learn not by conquering cold, but by paying attention to those who have always lived inside it. As night approaches again, you settle where the land curves gently, where wind passes overhead. You feel warmer there, even without additional layers. The choice itself adds insulation. You rest with this understanding now. Warmth without fire or metal was never purely human ingenuity. It was collaboration, quiet observation, borrowed wisdom from furred and feathered teachers who survived winter long before you arrived. And as sleep pulls you under once more, you realize that one of the oldest survival tools available was simply knowing when to watch and let the cold reveal its patterns through the lives moving within it. You feel the difference immediately when you leave the shelter for travel. Warmth behaves differently on the move. Inside, it is held. Outside, it must be carried carefully, guarded with attention rather than walls. Traveling in winter without fire or metal is not about speed. It is about arriving without losing what your body cannot easily replace. Across many indigenous winter travel traditions, it is broadly recognized that short intentional journeys were safer than long continuous marches. Distance was broken into manageable segments. Rest points were chosen in advance. Moving too far without stopping risked exhaustion, sweat, and sudden heat loss. You learn to think in pauses rather than miles. You walk with a steady rhythm, not fast, not slow. Your breath stays controlled. Your muscles work just enough to generate warmth without overheating. This balance feels delicate at first, then natural. You stop before fatigue forces you to stop. That choice keeps you warm later. There is an interesting practice noted in several winter accounts, where travelers carried minimal gear but exceptional knowledge. Instead of hauling heavy loads, they relied on the landscape to provide momentary shelter. A stand of trees, a snowdrift shaped by wind, a shallow depression near rocks. Each became a temporary refuge. Some historians still debate whether these travel strategies developed primarily from necessity or cultural preference. The evidence suggests necessity sharpened preference, heavy loads slowed movement, and increased sweating. Light travel preserved heat and flexibility. You notice how often people adjust their clothing while moving. A wrap loosens during exertion, tightens again when stopping. These micro adjustments happen without thought. Sweat is prevented before it appears. Dryness remains intact. There is a quirky detail remembered in a few oral traditions where travellers were taught to pause briefly with their backs to the wind before resting. This allowed heat generated during movement to settle into clothing rather than being stripped away immediately. Small rituals like this saved warmth over time. You kneel briefly, creating a windbreak with your body while resting. Standing rest is avoided. Sitting directly on snow is avoided too. You squat or kneel on a hide or pack. Position matters even during pauses. Scholars continue to explore how winter travel routes shifted seasonally. Paths used in summer were abandoned in winter. Frozen rivers became highways, snow flattened obstacles. Travel adapted rather than persisted blindly. You feel how silence matters on the move as well. Talking less conserves breath and warmth. Focus stays inward. Attention remains on sensation. Cold announces itself early if you listen. As you approach your destination, you do not rush. Arrival matters more than speed. You slow deliberately, allowing your body to cool gradually. Sudden stops trap sweat. Gradual transitions protect warmth. When you finally settle again, perhaps in another shelter or a temporary resting place, you feel intact. Warmth remains, energy remains. The journey did not steal from you. You realize now that winter travel without fire depended on restraint and foresight rather than toughness. Knowing when to stop mattered as much as knowing how to go. And as you rest once more, breathing slow and steady, you understand that movement itself was treated as a tool. Used carefully, it created warmth. Used carelessly, it destroyed it. Survival lay in knowing the difference. When you stop traveling and begin handling tools again, you notice how different they feel from the metal objects you are used to. There is no cold bite when you pick them up. No shock to the skin. What you hold feels closer to the temperature of your body, and that difference matters more than you might expect. It is a widely recognized reality in archaeological research that many indigenous winter tools were deliberately made from materials that did not drain heat quickly. Wood-bone, antler stone, and hide dominated daily life. These materials warmed to the touch instead of stealing warmth away. In cold conditions, that alone reduced strain on the body. You grip a wooden handle and feel how it responds. It does not pull heat from your palm, it settles into it. Bone tools behave the same way. Even stone, when handled briefly and intentionally, proves manageable. Metal, had it been present, would have punished every mistake with numbness. There is a small but fascinating detail recorded in several tool-making traditions. Handles were often shaped slightly thicker than strictly necessary. This was not inefficiency. Thicker grips reduced surface contact between skin and cold air, allowing hands to stay warmer while working. Comfort was function. Some historians still debate whether tool shapes evolved primarily for thermal reasons or mechanical ones. The truth appears blended. A tool that is easy to use while wearing layered hand coverings is a tool that gets used more safely. Cold changes ergonomics. Designs followed. You notice that tasks requiring fine motor control are limited in winter. Tool use shifts toward broader movements. Scraping, cutting, pounding. Precision work waits for warmer seasons or warmer moments. This scheduling protects fingers from prolonged exposure. There is a quirky observation noted by early observers, who commented that indigenous winter tools often looked simple compared to European ones. What they failed to see was adaptation. Simplicity reduced exposure time, fewer adjustments, fewer parts to fumble with cold hands. Efficiency mattered more than elegance. You feel how hides and bindings replace nails and joints. Rawhide shrinks when dry, tightening connections without tools. When it loosens slightly with moisture, it can be adjusted easily. This flexibility allows repairs without heat or metal. Maintenance becomes possible even in cold. Scholars continue to examine how much winter tool design was seasonal versus universal. Evidence suggests some tools were used only during cold months, built specifically to function with stiff fingers and layered hands. Others were adapted versions of all-season tools. Again, flexibility wins. You also notice how tools are stored, not left exposed, not placed directly on snow. They rest on hides or wood, insulated from moisture. Wet tools chill hands faster. Dry tools cooperate. There is an old teaching, remembered in some regions, that tools should never be colder than your breath. Before use, they are held briefly close to the body, warm just enough. This habit prevents shock to the skin and improves control. It costs nothing. It saves warmth. As you work briefly, then stop, you feel no sharp loss of heat. Tools do not betray you. They assist without demanding payment in warmth. This trust matters. Cold punishes unreliable equipment. Modern narratives often celebrate advanced materials. Here, advancement meant suitability. Tools fit the season as carefully as clothing fit the body. You set the tool down and return it to its place. The task is done. No excess effort, no wasted exposure. Hands remain warm enough to function. As you settle again into rest, you realize that surviving winter without fire or metal required not only knowing how to build warmth, but knowing how to avoid losing it through the smallest contact points. Tools were chosen, shaped, and treated as extensions of the body, not obstacles to it. And as the shelter quiets once more, you feel grateful for objects that did their work without stealing from you, allowing warmth to remain where it belonged. You begin to sense that knowledge here does not arrive as instruction. No one gathers everyone together to explain winter survival in careful steps. Instead, understanding moves quietly through the group, past hand to hand, breath to breath, moment to moment. Warmth depends on this kind of learning more than on any single technique. It is commonly acknowledged by historians studying indigenous societies that essential survival knowledge was transmitted through daily practice rather than formal teaching. Children learned where to sit, how to dress, when to move, and when to stay still by being present. Correction was gentle. Example did the work. You notice how often stories surface during long winter evenings. Not lectures, stories, a tale about a difficult winter, a journey that went wrong, someone who ignored a warning and paid for it. These stories are not framed as lessons, but the lessons linger. Memory holds on to narrative better than instruction, especially when warmth and safety are at stake. There is a small but striking detail found in several oral histories. Elders sometimes told winter stories more slowly than stories from other seasons. Pauses stretched, voices softened. This was not just atmosphere. Slower speech encouraged slower breathing. Slower breathing conserved warmth. Storytelling itself became part of the thermal system. Researchers still explore how much winter knowledge was consciously categorized versus intuitively absorbed. There are no manuals left behind. What remains are patterns, repeated behaviors, consistent shelter placement, similar clothing adjustments across generations. Knowledge lived in the body as much as in the mind. You watch a child mimic an adult's movement, adjusting a wrap, just so, copying posture, learning without being told. This imitation builds muscle memory long before abstract understanding forms. By adulthood, responses to cold feel automatic. Thinking comes later, if at all. There is a quirky anecdote, preserved in a few regions, where elders deliberately allowed small harmless mistakes in early winter so children could feel the consequences without danger. A slightly damp glove, a poorly placed layer. The discomfort taught more effectively than warning ever could. The body remembers. Scholars continue to debate how much of this knowledge transmission was resilient to disruption. Colonization, displacement, and enforced cultural changes interrupted these quiet learning systems. What survived often did so because it was embedded in habit rather than written down. Habit is hard to erase. You also notice how knowledge flows both ways. Younger members bring fresh observation. Elders bring context. Someone notices a change in wind pattern. Another recalls a winter years ago that behaved the same way. Decisions form collectively, informed by memory and attention. There is no sense of hoarding knowledge. Warmth depends on shared understanding. If one person misjudges conditions, others step in. Correction is immediate but calm, no shame. Shame creates tension. Tension burns heat. As the night deepens, again, stories taper off. The last words spoken are usually reassuring, familiar, predictable. Predictability calms the nervous system. Calm preserves warmth. Even conversation obeys the logic of survival. Modern education often separates learning from living. Here they are inseparable. You learn by staying warm. You stay warm by learning. The loop reinforces itself across generations. You settle back into rest aware now that survival without fire or metal required not only techniques, but continuity. Knowledge had to move forward intact through time. Each winter tested it. Each winter refined it. And as sleep returns carried on the echo of quiet stories and shared memory, you understand that warmth here was never just physical. It was cultural, passed down gently, patiently, until it became instinct. You begin to sense that warmth here carries meaning beyond comfort. It is tied to identity, to memory, to the quiet belief that enduring winter is not merely a physical challenge, but a reflection of who you are within the world. Cold tests the body, yes, but it also tests purpose. It is broadly recognized by cultural historians that many indigenous communities understood winter endurance as a deeply meaningful season rather than an obstacle to be defeated. Staying warm without fire or metal was not framed as deprivation. It was framed as alignment. Living correctly with the season meant respecting its limits and accepting its lessons. You feel this in the way people speak about winter, not with dread, not with bravado, with seriousness and calm respect. Winter is addressed almost like a teacher, harsh but fair. Those who listen learn, those who ignore suffer. This framing shapes behaviour long before cold ever becomes dangerous. There is a subtle but powerful detail preserved in several winter traditions. People often mark the first deep cold not with complaint but with acknowledgement. A phrase spoken, a quiet pause, a recognition that life had shifted modes. This mental transition mattered. Resisting winter mentally wasted energy. Accepting it conserved warmth. Some scholars continue to explore how spiritual beliefs influenced physical survival. Did belief systems actively improve outcomes, or did they simply reflect practical knowledge? Evidence suggests belief reinforced discipline. When warmth is treated as sacred rather than optional, people protect it more carefully. You notice how rituals slow movement, how they bring people together, how they reinforce shared timing. Rituals do not generate heat directly, but they generate cohesion. Cohesion supports shared warmth. Shared warmth reduces risk. The chain holds. There is a curious anecdote found in a few accounts where people described winter spirits as drawn to disorder. Loud arguments, reckless behaviour, wasteful movement. Whether symbolic or literal, the lesson remained clear. Disorder invited danger. Order preserved life. You feel how calm reverence settles the body. Fear recedes, impulses soften, muscles relax. The body responds to meaning just as it responds to shelter and clothing. Modern science might call this stress reduction. Here it is simply living rightly in season. Historians still debate how much these spiritual frameworks emerged from survival necessity versus how much they shaped survival strategies themselves. The relationship runs both ways. Belief-guided behaviour. Successful behaviour reinforced belief. Over generations, the distinction blurred. You listen as an elder speaks softly about winters past. Not boasting, not dramatising, just recounting. Memory becomes a tool. It reminds everyone that this has been done before, that warmth can be held, that patience works. You realise that hope itself has thermal value. Despair tightens the body. Tightness burns energy. Hope relaxes the system. It keeps breathing slow, movement measured, warmth stays close. Modern discussions of survival often strip meaning away, reducing endurance to mechanics. What you experience here tells a fuller story. Meaning is not extra, it is functional. It shapes decisions, it steadies nerves, it preserves warmth indirectly, but powerfully. As night settles again, ritual gives way to rest. The shelter grows quiet, breathing slows. The cold waits outside, unchanged. Inside, belief holds steady. You drift towards sleep, now aware that staying warm without fire or metal required more than clever design. It required a worldview that made restraint honourable, patience meaningful, and survival a shared moral effort. And as you rest wrapped, not only in fur and earth, but in purpose itself, you understand that warmth here was not only something you felt, it was something you belonged to. You become aware now of limits, not in a frightening way, but in a clear and honest one. Everything you have learned works remarkably well, but nothing works forever. The body is capable, resilient, adaptable, yet it is not infinite. Winter teaches this gently. At first, then more firmly, if ignored. There is a well-grounded understanding among researchers of cold survival that even the most refined strategies have thresholds. Below certain temperatures, or beyond certain durations, the human body begins to lose ground, no matter how skilled the response. Indigenous winter knowledge did not deny this reality. It respected it. Knowing when conditions exceeded safe limits was as important as knowing how to endure. You feel how fatigue creeps in differently during deep cold. Not dramatic exhaustion, but a dull heaviness. Reaction time slows, small tasks require more focus. These signals are not dismissed as weakness. They are treated as information. When the body speaks this way, plans change. You notice how people shorten exposure when cold intensifies beyond expectation. Travel pauses, tasks are delayed, extra clustering happens earlier. No one insists on proving toughness. Survival does not reward pride. There is a small but sobering detail found in winter oral histories. Elders spoke openly about times when people did not survive not to frighten, but to clarify boundaries. Certain storms could not be waited out in the open. Certain cold snaps demanded absolute stillness and conservation. These stories reinforced humility rather than fear. Some historians continue to explore how communities assessed risk without thermometers or forecasts. The answer appears to lie in layered observation, animal behaviour, wind changes, sound in the snow, physical sensation. When multiple signs aligned, action followed. Limits were recognised early rather than tested late. You feel this awareness settle into you now. You no longer assume that cleverness alone guarantees safety. You understand that survival included knowing when not to push further, when to retreat, when to simply stay put and let the cold pass. There is an unusual account from early winter observers who noted that indigenous guides sometimes refused to proceed even when conditions looked manageable to outsiders. Later, sudden weather shifts proved those decisions wise. Experience taught caution where optimism might fail. You notice how the group responds collectively to increased cold stress. No panic, just tightening of systems, layers adjusted, movement reduced, silence deepened. Everything contracts inward. This contraction preserves warmth and focus. Scholars still debate how much of this limit awareness was instinctual versus culturally reinforced. Likely both. Bodies learned through exposure. Culture taught restraint. Together they formed a reliable warning system. You reflect on how modern life often encourages pushing limits, celebrating endurance without pause. Here endurance is measured differently. It is measured by how little you have to recover from afterward. As night deepens and cold presses harder than usual, you feel the shelter respond. It holds. Bodies cluster closer, breath thickens the air slightly. Snow adds insulation. The system adapts, but it also narrows. Everything unnecessary falls away. You rest with this understanding now. Survival here was never about pretending the body had no limits. It was about respecting those limits before they became emergencies. And as sleep comes again steady and deep, you understand that wisdom in winter meant knowing not only how to stay warm, but when to stop asking the body for more than it could safely give. You begin to notice a change not in the weather, but in the people who arrive from elsewhere. They come wrapped in unfamiliar clothing, carrying habits shaped by other winters, other assumptions. They look at the shelters low to the ground and assume poverty. They see the absence of constant fire and assume danger. They misunderstand warmth because they are measuring it by the wrong standards. It is a widely acknowledged historical reality that when Europeans first encountered indigenous winter lifeways, many failed to recognize how effective they were. Observers recorded astonishment that people remained healthy and active in conditions that left newcomers weak, frostbitten, or ill. The absence of metal tools and open hearths looked like lack. In truth, it was adaptation. You watch these newcomers struggle. Their heavy garments trap sweat. Their rigid tools steal heat from bare hands. Their tall shelters catch wind and leak warmth relentlessly. Fires burn brightly, then fail suddenly when fuel runs low. Smoke irritates lungs already stressed by cold. They work harder and grow colder. There is a telling anecdote from early contact periods where settlers mocked the small size of indigenous winter shelters, calling them cramped or animal-like. Yet many of those same settlers later crowded into them during storms, desperate for the stable warmth they could not maintain on their own. Pride cooled quickly in winter. Some historians still debate how much early misunderstanding stemmed from cultural bias versus genuine ignorance. Written records often dismissed indigenous practices as primitive even while quietly adopting them. Snowbanking, layered bedding, low entrances. These methods spread without credit, reshaped to fit foreign narratives. You feel the tension in these encounters. Knowledge is present but not always shared freely. Trust must exist before teaching happens. Winter does not allow endless mistakes. Those who listened learned. Those who insisted on their own methods paid for it. There is a small but revealing detail found in several journals. Newcomers often complained that indigenous people did not seem cold enough. They interpreted calm as insensitivity. What they missed was management. People felt cold, they simply did not let it control behaviour. Scholars continue to explore how much indigenous winter knowledge influenced later frontier survival practices. Evidence suggests a deep, if often unacknowledged, transfer. Techniques that kept trappers, traders, and settlers alive in northern winters frequently originated in indigenous communities. You notice how indigenous responses to cold remain steady even as outsiders panic. No rushing, no frantic fuel gathering. Systems already in place simply tighten. Warmth holds because it was never dependent on abundance. Modern narratives sometimes frame these encounters as moments of technological advancement meeting tradition. What you see instead is mismatched understanding. One side trusted external tools, the other trusted systems refined by generations of winter. As night settles again, you retreat into shelter that does not need to prove itself. It has already done so. Breath warms the air. Bodies cluster, snow seals gaps. The outside world may misunderstand, but the cold does not care about opinion. You rest with this clarity now. Surviving winter without fire or metal was not a sign of lacking technology. It was a sign of having the right one. And as sleep returns, you understand that much of what later generations called ingenuity was simply humility, the willingness to learn from the land and from those who already knew how to live within it. You start to notice how stories about winter survival get simplified once they travel far from the cold itself. Complex systems turn into single tricks. Careful restraint becomes toughness. Patience becomes luck. Over time, the truth cools and stiffens, losing flexibility, just like an untended body in winter. It is generally accepted among historians of North American history that many popular ideas about indigenous winter life were shaped more by outsiders' assumptions than by lived reality. Accounts focused on what seemed missing rather than what was present. No metal meant primitive, no roaring fires meant suffering. These conclusions missed the deeper logic entirely. You hear echoes of these misunderstandings even now, stories that frame survival as a heroic battle against nature rather than a quiet collaboration. Tales that praise endurance while ignoring preparation. These myths feel exciting, but they are inaccurate. Winter does not reward drama, it rewards consistency. There is a quirky misconception that appears again and again in old travel writings. Some outsiders believed indigenous people simply tolerated cold better because of biology alone. They assumed thicker skin or unusual resistance. What they overlooked was behavior, clothing adjustment, shelter placement, timing. Calm, remove those, and nobody fares well. Historians still argue whether these biological explanations were convenient excuses to ignore indigenous knowledge. By attributing survival to innate difference, outsiders avoided admitting they needed to learn. The debate remains active, but the pattern is clear. Dismissing knowledge is easier than changing habits. You reflect on how myths often erase community. Popular stories center lone figures surviving against impossible odds. What you have experienced here shows the opposite. Warmth without fire or metal depended on groups. Shared labor, shared heat, shared attention. Remove the group and the system weakens quickly. There is a telling detail preserved in a few later accounts where settlers attempted to replicate indigenous shelters but used them alone. They failed. Without clustered bodies, without practiced stillness, without correct timing, the shelters felt cold and ineffective. The design was copied, but the culture was not. Scholars continue to examine how much knowledge was lost when practices were taken out of context. Techniques divorced from worldview lose power. A low shelter without patience leaks warmth. Fur without moisture, management chills. Snow without understanding collapses. The system only works as a whole. You notice how myths also favour speed. Fast building, fast travel, fast solutions. Everything you have learned moves slowly. Slowly gathering materials, slowly adjusting layers, slowly letting heat build. Winter punishes haste. Myth encourages it. Modern survival media often promises shortcuts. One tool, one trick, one secret. What winter taught here was the opposite. There were no secrets, only habits practiced daily until they became invisible. As evening settles again, you feel grounded in what is real rather than what is told. Warmth holds. Systems hum quietly, no drama required. You rest now with a clearer understanding. Misunderstandings about indigenous winter survival were not harmless. They obscured knowledge that could save lives. They replaced attention with arrogance. And as sleep draws you in once more, you recognize that the greatest myth was the idea that surviving winter required extraordinary strength. In truth, it required ordinary care, practiced faithfully, night after night, until warmth felt less like a victory and more like a steady companion. You find yourself lingering on questions that never fully settle. Even after generations of study, careful excavation, and comparison of stories, some details about how warmth was managed remain just out of reach. The cold preserved bodies and objects, but it did not preserve every answer. What remains is a landscape of educated uncertainty. It is widely recognized in modern archaeology that material evidence can only tell part of the story. Shelters leave impressions, tools leave traces, bedding leaves faint marks in soil, but behaviors, timing, and subtle adjustments often vanish without a sound. What you have learned so far comes from stitching fragments together and accepting that some seams will always show. You imagine archaeologists kneeling where you once slept, trying to interpret flattened grasses or compacted earth. Was this a sleeping place or a storage area? Was this shelter used year-round or only during the deepest cold? These questions do not always resolve cleanly. The ground answers slowly, if at all. There is a curious detail debated quietly in academic circles regarding how often certain shelters were rebuilt versus maintained. Some evidence suggests structures were reused across winters. Other sites imply frequent rebuilding. Scholars still debate whether this reflects environmental change, cultural preference, or seasonal mobility. Each explanation carries weight, and none fully cancels the others. You notice how much knowledge lives in motion rather than structure. The way a person shifted during sleep, the moment a layer was loosened, the instinct to stop walking just before sweat formed. These actions leave no artifacts. They live only in memory and practice. There is an unusual anecdote from early excavation reports, where researchers noted that reconstructed shelters often felt colder than expected. Later, they realized that reconstructions lacked people. Without bodies' breath and movement, the structures failed to behave as they once did. The warmth was never in the walls alone. Some historians continue to examine whether modern experimental archaeology can truly replicate winter lifeways. Volunteers build shelters, they wear replicated clothing, they test endurance. Yet modern minds struggle to fully release modern habits, artificial pacing, external rescue options, different diets. The context always leaks in. You feel this gap now. You understand the principles, but you also understand how much depended on growing up inside them. Winter knowledge was layered over years, not downloaded in moments. Muscle memory mattered. Emotional regulation mattered. These things resist easy measurement. There is a small but telling observation made by researchers working closely with living indigenous communities. Elders sometimes respond to technical questions with stories rather than answers. Not evasively, intentionally. Stories preserve relationships between elements rather than isolating variables. Warmth came from relationships. Scholars still debate how much ancient winter practices can be fully recovered versus respectfully inferred. Some argue reconstruction risks oversimplification. Others argue that not trying risks losing insight entirely. The balance remains delicate. You sit with this uncertainty now, not frustrated, but appreciative. Knowledge that leaves room for humility stays alive. Winter punished certainty more than curiosity. Those who assumed they knew enough stopped paying attention. Those who remained observant adapted. As night settles again, you feel warmth hold steady despite unanswered questions. The system does not require complete understanding to function. It requires respect, attention, willingness to adjust. You rest with this awareness, knowing that some aspects of how people stayed warm, without fire or metal, will always remain partially hidden like heat moving through earth. Felt rather than seen. And as sleep arrives gently once more, you understand that not knowing everything did not stop survival. It sharpened it. The cold taught people to live with uncertainty, to respond rather than dominate, and to let wisdom remain flexible enough to endure. You begin to notice how strange modern warmth feels when you think about it from here. Constant, immediate, unquestioned. Heat pours from walls and floors without effort or attention, and because of that you rarely notice it at all. What was once precious has become invisible. It is widely acknowledged by historians of technology and daily life that industrial heating dramatically altered how humans relate to cold. Centralized warmth removed the need for constant awareness. Clothing simplified, shelter design shifted upward and outward. Many of the quiet skills you have been learning faded not because they failed, but because they were no longer demanded. You imagine bringing some of this older knowledge forward, not as nostalgia, but as awareness. You would notice drafts more quickly. You would layer differently. You would understand that feeling slightly cool while moving is safer than overheating. These lessons remain relevant even now. There is a quirky realization that surprises many people who try winter camping for the first time using traditional techniques. They often report feeling calmer, sleeping more deeply, and waking more refreshed despite colder conditions. The absence of artificial heat creates a rhythm the body recognizes. Modern comfort, it turns out, can sometimes overstimulate rather than soothe. Some scholars still debate whether modern humans have lost cold tolerance biologically or simply behaviorally. Evidence suggests behavior plays the larger role. Bodies remain capable. Attention has shifted. Without practice, sensitivity dulls. With practice, it returns. You reflect on how often modern life encourages excess. Too many layers, too much movement, too much noise, all of it burns energy unnecessarily. What you have learned here values moderation, precision, restraint. There is an old teaching echoed in several winter traditions that says comfort dulls listening. When warmth arrives automatically, you stop paying attention to how your body responds. When warmth must be maintained, awareness sharpens. This awareness was not a burden, it was grounding. You think about emergencies now, power outages, sudden storms, situations where modern systems fail. In those moments, the old knowledge resurfaces quickly for those who remember it. Layering, stillness, wind management, community. These are not obsolete skills, they are dormant ones. Historians continue to examine how much traditional winter knowledge could inform modern resilience. Some argue it has limited application. Others suggest it offers essential lessons in adaptability and energy conservation. The discussion remains open, but interest is growing. You feel a quiet respect for the people who live this knowledge daily, not as a hobby or experiment, but as life itself. They did not seek hardship, they sought balance. Warmth was not indulgence, it was stewardship. As evening settles again, you rest easily, surrounded by the hum of systems working without effort. You feel no urge to prove anything. The cold is managed, the body is calm. You realize now that what was forgotten was not just technique, but relationship. Relationship with cold, with time, with one another. Relearning that relationship does not require abandoning modern life. It requires attention. And as you drift towards sleep once more, you carry with you a quiet understanding. Warmth is most meaningful when it is noticed, when it is cared for, when it is shared. That lesson at least has never gone out of season. You feel the long arc of winter drawing gently towards stillness now. Not an ending exactly, but a settling. Everything you have learned no longer feels like a list of techniques. It feels like a posture toward the world, a way of inhabiting cold without fighting it. Across the long span of indigenous history, it is clear that staying warm without fire or metal was never a single invention or clever workaround. It was a woven system built slowly through attention, patience, and collective memory. Shelter, clothing, movement, food, breath, calm timing, and care all leaned into one another. Remove one thread, and the fabric weakened. Keep them together, and winter softened its grip. You sit quietly inside the shelter, one last time, noticing how little effort warmth now requires. Your body knows where to be. Your breath knows its pace. The air feels familiar. The ground supports you without demand. Nothing dramatic happens, and that is the point. There is a small detail sometimes overlooked in modern retellings of winter survival. People did not aim to feel cozy in the way you might imagine today. They aimed to feel steady, warm enough, safe enough, calm enough. That steadiness allowed life to continue without burning through energy or hope. Some historians still discuss whether this kind of winter living produced stronger bodies or simply wiser habits. The distinction matters less than the outcome. People endured, communities persisted, knowledge moved forward intact. You reflect on how every choice you witnessed worked quietly. No roaring flames, no glowing metal, just human bodies cooperating with land season and one another. Warmth emerged not as conquest but as consequence. As the night deepens again, the shelter grows silent. Breath slows, muscles release, snow presses gently from above, insulating rather than threatening. The cold remains outside present, but managed, acknowledged, but not feared. You lie back now, feeling the curve of earth beneath you, the shared heat around you, the calm within you. Nothing needs to be proven, nothing needs to be fixed. Winter is being met exactly as it should be. Now the pace softens even further. You no longer think about techniques or history or explanations. You simply feel the quiet success of them working together. The shelter breathes slowly. The air feels warm enough to rest inside. Outside, the cold drifts past, unable to find a way in. Your body sinks heavier into the layers beneath you. Muscles loosen, jaw unclenches. Even your thoughts stretch out and slow, becoming less sharp, less demanding. There is nothing you need to remember now, nothing you need to prepare for. You imagine the long winters that came before this one, each survived not through urgency, but through patience, through people paying attention to small things and caring for one another quietly. That care lingers here, steady and reassuring. Breathing deepens. Each exhale feels longer than the last. The air around your face feels soft, familiar, safe. You're held by systems that do not rush you, that do not demand anything in return. The cold outside fades into a distant idea. The warmth inside settles into something deeper than comfort. It becomes rest. You let yourself drift fully now. Sweet dreams.